So this was a perspective from the New England Aquarium's emergency responders, myself and Connie Marigo. As many of you know, in January of this year, Florida had encountered a cold stunning event. Between the 3rd and the 14th of January, all those days were below freezing. Thus, lagoons and estuaries in Florida were dropping to near 40 degrees. Most of these strandings took place in 10 counties. 4,591 sea turtles stranded alive. Of that number, 4,369 were green sea turtles. 948 were dead. So we got the call. We decided to leave the New England Aquarium up on your left the snow behind and headed down to cold Florida. It's really tough. So we spent most of our time at 2 facilities, the Loggerhead Marine Life Center in Juno Beach, Florida, and at Gumbo Limbo Nature Center in Boca Raton, Florida. Those are both headed by Dr. Nancy Meddy for the head veterinarian. And of those 2 facilities, we spent the majority of our time at Gumbo Limbo. They actually received their permit on January 1st to work with rehabilitated sea turtles. And as you can see, they were permitted for 30 to 35 turtles per year. They were expecting to keep anywhere between 8 and 9 turtles at one time. They had 177 turtles during this event. And the majority of the staff there had only had hatching experience. And as you'll see in coming slides, it's not what these guys were. So it was kind of a different thing for us. Up in the Northeast and New England specifically, we're dealing with chronic animals that have been out in the cold for a long time, typically weeks, whereas they were experiencing more of an acute cold stun event down in Florida. Those animals were spending time in that cold weather for about days. Our animals technically aren't getting pulled out of the water. They're stranding on beaches, so they'll hit the beach and then get brought up to us. Whereas the animals down in Florida were getting plucked from the lagoons and estuaries. Our turtles, most of the issues there were clinical issues from the cold stunning, the pneumonia, emaciation, and frostbite. Most of the turtles that were coming in down in Florida looked fairly well, but they had a lot of incidental clinical issues that necessarily wouldn't have stranded these animals, but the Fibropapiloma, boat strike, and leeches, leech eggs, which is pretty good. Photo later, but in our animals we had long rehab. We typically have long rehab time, months, whereas down in Florida they were turning those animals around in days sometimes. The Fibropapiloma turtles were a little bit longer, but some examples of our cold stunning are up in Cape Cod Bay, Long Island Sound, and down south they were mostly intracoastal, Mosquito Lagoon, the typical like Banana Lagoon as well, the Indian River system. So the next few slides kind of show some of the differences. You can see the turtle on the left is a cold stun Kempsridley up on the beach. This is where we would typically see our animals on the rack line, whereas down south they were heading out into the lagoons. The ones in the Merritt Island area actually were also getting help from NASA spotting the animals, and then they would go out in the boats and actually pick them out of the water. Again, animals to the left were animals that came into the aquarium this year. Emaciated, dehydration, hypothermia, frostbite. Animals to the right, for the most part, fairly good weights. You can see the top animal had a fairly high Fibropapiloma burden. Again, smaller turtles on the left and a nice little pool. The ones on the right, that's actually a 30-foot diameter pool that's 12 feet deep. Those animals that are in there, majority of those were 35 pounds or greater. Again, just still some examples, small banana boxes, little kiddie pools, and 30, 40-gallon totes holding big green sea turtles. One thing that Dr. Meddy had set up was this priority system, and she actually color-coded it. That helped out a lot. Was you had your red, your priority 1 turtles. These are animals that had external injuries, your blood values were more extreme. They had corneal abrasion, so they would take up some fluorescein. Then you had your blue turtles. These were priority 2 animals, superficial injuries, minor hypoglycemia, hypokalemia. And then your green priority 3 turtles, these are the ones you're going to do your minimal treating and then get them back out into the water. As you can see in the picture to the right there, that's how some of these turtles would show up at these facilities, just kind of stacked on top of each other. So, training the trainers, Connie and I kind of split up. You can see Connie decided to take the nice covered area, whereas I was out in the weather. Whereas most of these people hadn't had experience with juvenile to adult animals, we just kind of went over the basis of what they were looking for the cold stun symptoms, teaching them how to stain eyes, what are they looking at, what's normal behavior, what's not, kind of doing full body exams. So a lot of these turtles only needed to be warmed. Unfortunately, the waters up north were still too cold, and typically a lot of times in Florida, what they like to do is release from the same area that they found the animals, but because of that long-term event, they weren't able to. So they brought, in one day, 400 turtles down to Juno Beach, which they released those 400 animals, which took about 10 hours to get all those animals out. Other non-critical animals would receive 5 treatments of antibiotics and then released. So again, priority 2, the blue animals. These were animals that just needed some help, minor superficial crackings on shells, minor issues with blood. And then you'd had more of your long-term animals. That animal in the left there, that green that you see the light, some turtles had the fluorescein uptake. The majority of those actually came from the transport. And as you saw in that picture earlier, the animals would, you'd put them in, they weren't moving. By the time they'd be getting to the spots where they're going, they would have kind of crawled on top of each other. So they had a lot of eye injuries from other turtles, flippers, or shells. There was one incident of an adult green that was actually moved and got on top of I think it was a 25-pound green sea turtle and kind of crushed that animal that they nicknamed Squishy. Was released, so he actually did all right. But we saw other things, you had the boat strikes, the loggerhead in the bottom there, that had a fairly good shark bite on it. And then we had one day where an animal came in, that person on a dock actually caught a green turtle and brought it into us, and it had the hook in the mouth. Unfortunately, because Gumbo Limbo had only received their permit, they hadn't set up a correspondence with a local zoo for x-rays yet. And because they were getting a lot of Fibropapiloma turtles, those animals were quarantined, so they weren't able to go and get x-rays. So we kind of had to use floating turtles as a diagnostic tool. So you'll see in the turtle on the side to the top left, there's a floating animal there. Those animals would have continued with more of an antifungal treatment as well as nebulization. So not in New England anymore. These are things that we don't typically see. The Fibropapiloma turtles, New England Aquarium hasn't seen any. Leech eggs, working outside, especially in January. Intracoelemic fluids, and big turtles. So as you can see, the picture to the left is actually, they're scraping leech eggs off of that turtle, which not as bad as in that picture, but they were pretty gross. They really get into those animals. And the 2 turtles in the middle there, the one at the top was a 400-pound green sea turtle adult. The one at the bottom was about 250 pounds. And then the intracoelemic injections, which we don't really do at the aquarium. That was kind of a little culture shock, flipping the turtles over onto their carapace and injecting the fluids into the coelomic cavity. Fibropapiloma gets its own slide. This is something that we don't work with, we haven't seen at our aquarium. The majority of these animals, they typically, there's 2 different kinds that I found out from people down there. You have the smooth and the cauliflower. We also would have to betadine some of the necrotic pap tumors. Some of these tumors almost weighed as much as some of the turtles that were down there. The unfortunate thing, too, that turtle in the middle there, if they had bilateral pap tumors on corneas. Those animals did have to be euthanized. Gumbo Limbo actually had an event there as well the following week after we had left, where they took their 35 turtles that had the FP, and it was a multi-agency event, and did surgery on 35 animals, removing pap tumors from those turtles. And I'm expecting to see a lot of good papers come from this. Several researchers had come through the center while we were there, and a lot of learning about the FP. So just some general observations while we were down there. It was just the teamwork. It was really amazing to see this group that hadn't really been working together really come together and for the greater good of these turtles. Feeding, that was one thing where I think we kind of dropped the ball a little bit. We were so set on clinics that we didn't realize that the turtles weren't being fed in a proper, really kind of not a proper way, but the amount of turtles that were there, they were kind of just feeding, putting food into the tanks, then collecting it at the end of the day, but they weren't really target feeding these animals. So some animals we weren't sure if they were eating or not, and again, we would need that for diagnostics. Skip over the overall attitude of that group, just the fact that we had been there a week afterwards, and they got along so well that, you know, there was no fighting. You know, they'd been doing this for hours of days, and several people hadn't even had a day off, so it was just a good group to work with, and interesting seeing how they work with each other and how they work with the turtles as opposed to what we do. And then just kind of some innovations, that triage system that Nancy had set up, as well as the turtle elevator. That giant pool had to be cleaned. So they had 35 turtles in there, all greater than 35, 40 pounds. And instead of keeping them out, they took a super scooper, or a super scoop, I guess, kind of made a little elevator out of it. So we didn't have to wait the 12 hours for that pool to refill. And so they just decided, why don't we try this, and it worked pretty well. I took a movie of you. And you can see the other turtles that were already down there. The P in front of those numbers basically meant those turtles had Fibropapiloma. And thank you.
Did you guys notice if the presence of the FB was more so on the larger size class animals, or did you see it distributed throughout the?
We saw it pretty much distributed fairly evenly. From talking to one of the researchers down there, most of the turtles that have the FP were coming out of the lagoon, the intertidal, or the intercoastal rather, systems, whereas the majority of the turtles that come out of the Atlantic they don't typically see that. So, you know, they think that when the adults kind of start intermingling with the juveniles, that's when the juveniles might pick it up. But, you know, you'll see those tumors in like areas where there's a lot of abrasion or rubbing. Boat strikes, you know, the couple animals that had boat strikes, the tumors were in those areas as well. And again, unfortunately, because of the radiographs, we weren't able to tell if any of those animals that we had internal tumors. And because these animals weren't picked up because of the FP, it was because of the cold stunning. You know, typically they'd like to keep those animals for long term after they've removed those tumors, but again, because that was an incidental diagnosis, I guess, those animals were released prior to, typically they like to hold them for a year, but.
It's impressive that the network's in place where, you know, when the aquarium could get involved with the project, ultimately, you know, while south of the region. Were other organizations also called in to the teaching?
I know Shed sent someone down as well, and you know, a lot of it came from, you know, the fisheries services, the southeast and the northeast, kind of figuring out, you know, who had availability, who could go, and you know, fortunately we were able to go. And, you know, working for a large organization like the aquarium, you know, funding wasn't as much as an issue, you know, so that's why we were able to go. And being able to have that other staff that were able to kind of pick up, because we had a lot of turtles still in-house back at the aquarium, so it was one of those calls on it, you know, for our end, you know, to go out and help, because we just came from a lot of turtles being stranded. We knew what kind of pressure we were under, and, you know, that was, you know, you saw the number earlier, you know, about 90 animals. To have thousands of animals, you just knew that they were under a lot of stress down there. So.
How did NASA spot the animals before you collected them?
They had helicopters out. I guess Merritt Island and NASA are right next to each other. So there were the two staging areas where all the turtles would come into, and that was Merritt Island and Gulf World.